Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, we had the Beatles thinking of their lives beyond touring and the Beatles. John turned to acting, and he still had an open mind for various things that he could do, like writing, acting, playing music, etc. George decided to go to India to learn the sitar and all about the Indian spirituality. So now let's see what they're going to do next. It was while John was in Spain to do the movie How I Won the War. He was at an apartment when he began working on Strawberry Fields Forever. He was separated from his family and friends, so he became reflective and analytical. He wondered what he could do outside being a Beatle. Usually pop stars become diversified in order to capture a less fickle, family-oriented audience. So Elvis, he went into the movies and then to Las Vegas as a resident performer, and John didn't want to do that. Strawberry Fields Forever was a product of this period of uncertainty and self-examination. He said it was psychoanalysis set to music. The original opening line was going to be, "No one is on my wavelength," and he altered it from wavelength to "in my tree." He thought that if he kept the word wavelength, it might sound arrogant. In 1980, he stated, "Nobody seems to be as hip as me," is what I was saying. Therefore, I must be crazy or a genius. At this stage, he didn't have the word Strawberry Fields in the lyric or the title. He would sit on his bed at the apartment with an acoustic guitar and a cassette recorder by his side. John said it took him 6 weeks to write it. He was writing the song all the time he was making the film. There was a lot of spare time to do it because that's how the film work went. At this time, John was also reading Report to Greco. It was an autobiographical novel by Kikos Kansakis, and it told the story of a writer searching for spiritual meaning. Look magazine interviewed John on the set for the cover story, and he said that John was a compulsive seeker of truth about himself and about the world, but he wasn't the cynic that people assumed him to be. John said he hated tags. He said he was slightly cynical, but he was not a cynic. He said that one could be wry one day and cynical the next, and ironic the next. He said he was cynical about society, politics, newspapers, government, but he wasn't cynical about life, love, goodness, or death. In London, Paul and Jane had settled into Cavendish Avenue, and when Paul was alone, he invited Maggie McGivern to visit. Jane wasn't discussed. Jane was an independent woman who didn't want to sacrifice her career to be a pop star's other half. September the 30th, the first report of a Beatles no longer touring appeared in an American newspaper. John said, "We can get $500,000 for a special on TV, so why should we go through the terrible trial of being badgered by kids never seen any part of the ruddy country we're traveling through?" And Brian at this time was going through tough times. He had been in the hospital for what they said was glandular fever, but that wasn't the truth. He had attempted suicide by taking too many pills. He was discovered by Peter Brown, and he rushed him to the hospital to have his stomach pumped. He was then sent to Priory, a private hospital specializing in the management and treatment of mental health problems, including addictions and eating disorders. A suicide note was found later beside his bed, and it said, "This is all too much. I can't take it anymore." The Beatles were looking for new things, and to Brian, it felt like the beginning of the end. John spent 52 days in the wilderness in the Habaneras Desert in Spain. He began to miss the comforts of his normal life. He said it was like a dump. He said the desert was like the moon. It was just desert and sand and hills and mountains, and it wasn't very nice to look at, but the weather's okay. To make things easier, he had his chauffeur, Les Anthony, to bring his black Rolls-Royce Phantom 5 down to Almeria so he could be driven to work in style. He had the car fitted with internal speakers to listen to music, and also external speakers to prank passing strangers with bursts of loud noise. So I bet that went over well. Then there was a floating record player that stayed level even when the car hit bumps, so that sounded pretty neat. He had a fridge, a telephone, and a TV. Cynthia arrived with Julian on October the 5th, and Ringo and Maureen came to watch some of the filming and to celebrate John's 26th birthday on October the 9th. So there wasn't too much to do in Almeria during the evenings, so John passed the time watching TV, playing board games like Monopoly and Risk with fellow actor Michael Crawford, eating out, reading, and rehearsing the next day's lines. with Neil Aspinall. He had a part too, but it was a non-speaking part. The script kept changing during shooting, so John was needed on set, dressed and ready each day in case he was needed. And John got bored hanging around, and he didn't like the heat. He found relief in the form of playing impromptu cricket games with real bats and balls, but improvised stumps. Relaxing in the back of the rolls, the locals nicknamed the rolls El Funebre, the hearse, or smoking grass that had been delivered to him from London concealed inside boxes of candy. On October 7th, John was visited by photojournalist Zdenko Hirschler, and he got pictures of him playing cricket, picking up his lunch of stew and rice pudding from the catering caravan. Talking about the Beatles, John told Hirschler, "It's been a jolly good life, and we've had a good many laughs, but it can't go on forever." John was asked if he did the film because he was fed up with being a Beatle. "Oh no," John said, "it's not that. It's something else. It's like finishing school in a way. It's a problem for all of us. George is now in India, nosing around and shopping and taking sitar lessons, and Paul has bought a new house in North London and is so busy decorating it that he's finding little time to do anything else. Ringo is spending a week or so in Spain to watch me act. Each one of us has more or less the same dilemma, what to do in the future." When John took the role in the film because it offered him a challenge of portraying someone other than himself, but that's what he found difficult. All of his life he couldn't play a role, whether it was the obedient schoolboy or the cheerful, compliant celebrity. Even in his songwriting, he only wrote of his own experiences. He rarely wrote about experiences that were not his own. John felt self-conscious acting in front of assembled crew members. He spent years in a group, and he was self-conscious performing alone. Ringo wanted to be with John because he missed having the lads around, and he knew that John was lonely. He also wanted to see what it took to be an actor because if the Beatles were to break up, that seemed to be his only other position in the world of entertainment, beside the prospect of starting all over again as a drummer with a new group. Ringo said to Art Unger that he wanted to act, but he wasn't sure he'd be any good at it. Both of the roles he had at that time only required him to be Ringo. While heading back to the Strawberry Fields composition, John was thinking of the Salvation Army orphanage in Woolton, and it made a big impression on him as a young boy. The building looked gothic and foreboding, but the gardens were magical. John and his friends would climb over the walls among the trees and flowers, and they found a timeless kingdom of nature and adventure. He felt free from school, home, and city. There, it was 6 acres, 3 were garden and lawn. And Paul seemed to be the only Beatle left in town. He played tambourine with the Escorts when they covered the Miracle song, That Magic Feeling, and he was at the studio when Donovan recorded the single Mellow Yellow. When George and Patty returned to London from Bombay in late October after 5 weeks in India, George decided to decorate the exterior walls of his bungalow in bright psychedelic designs the following week. He drew crude, childish shapes on every available white surface: swirls, letters, orbs, flames, droplets, leaves, stars, flowers, and colored them in bright reds, yellows, greens, oranges, and blues. Each tile of the window ledges were painted a different color. Painting the outside of a house in a multitude of colors, like painting your piano or car, wasn't done in Britain. George was inspired by the exposure to color in India, and even cows were dabbed with paint. And George hired the Dutch artist Margriet Koger to design a psychedelic painting around the fireplace in his living room. Bright colors were used, but it was executed more professionally than the design on the outer walls. Within a huge circle, she featured a winter scene, a rainbow, a river, flying saucers, stars, mountains, flowers, and a central figure of a Buddha-like character sitting in a meditative pose. Paul was the last Beatle to take a break from England during the hiatus between the end of the final tour and the start of the next LP. Paul's first project outside the Beatles was to compose the soundtrack music for The Family Way. Paul had been thinking of a theme instead of an entire soundtrack. His involvement in music was minimal. He developed a short piano piece and gave it to George Martin to arrange and orchestrate. Paul said that Martin is the interpreter. Another piece was needed for a love scene at the heart of the film, but Paul, he was slow coming up with anything for it. And this got George Martin frustrated. He said he had to stand over Paul at his piano in Cavendish Avenue to coax him into tapping out a fragment of a tune that Martin could turn into a full-blown score to record with his orchestra. Martin told Paul, "You're supposed to be writing the music for this thing, and I'm supposed to be orchestrating it. But to do that, I need a tune, and you got to give me one." So Paul finally came up with a fragment of a waltz tune. And then Paul took an unaccompanied drive through France and down into Spain. And then he would take his Aston Martin with him and then drive without a timetable or a fixed route. So he wouldn't be spotted, he wore a theatrical mustache from Wig Creations until he could grow his own, a pair of glasses with clear lenses, and a long overcoat. He would also slick back his hair. He took his 8mm movie camera and some notebooks to record his journey. And in each town he would walk through, taking photos and shopping for antiques. And at the end of the day, he would retire to his room to write in his journal. After a few days by himself, he met up with Mal Evans at a pre-planned location in Bordeaux, and then they headed for the Spanish border. After going to Madrid, they planned to go to Almeria to see John. Nims informed them that John had left Spain, so they changed their plans. Paul booked a safari in Kenya through a travel agent. They stayed at a luxury lodge in Tsavo National Park, watched hippos and crocodiles from an underwater viewing chamber at Mazima Springs. They saw Mount Kilimanjaro while at the game reserve, and they spent a night at the renowned Treetops Hotel. Their driver Moses took them everywhere in his old blue Plymouth. The final night on November 18th was spent at the Central YMCA at State House Avenue in Nairobi. Paul sang to a group of children on the lawn outside, while Mal went out shopping for gifts in the late afternoon. And traveling gave Paul a sense of freedom. Flying back to London from Nairobi, Paul started to draft ideas about the Beatles assuming the identity of another group. It was at this time that John Lennon was invited to Yoko's art exhibit. It was November the 7th. He took a look at the works, all of which in some way required the spectator to complete the art through an action or an expression of surprise, relief, or laughter. Examples of what was there: hammer and nails piece consisted of a block of mahogany, a hammer with a gold-plated head, and a small jar of gold-plated nails. The hammer was chained to the wood. Apple piece was a fresh apple renewed each day on a plexiglass stand with a price tag reading 200 pounds, and an all-white chess set stood on a white table next to a white chair. John thought it was bonkers. The first exhibit that John connected to was called Ladder Piece. A small card was pasted to the ceiling above, a white stepladder, and next to the card dangled a magnifying glass. So John climbed the ladder and saw the small card had something printed on it in small typeface. He took the glass and it read the single word yes. He later said that the piece was affirmative, and it was also funny. They made a connection that day. Yoko said it was fantastic. That was what my art was about. It was my game. The two of us were playing the same game. John didn't really care for avant-garde art. He loved rock and roll because it was visceral, primitive, and unpretentious. And yet, he was cerebral, cultivated, and intellectual. During 1966, John and Cynthia had been drifting apart for years. If she hadn't become pregnant and they had married in 1962, they probably wouldn't have stayed together. When they met, he was a teddy boy and she was a conventional girl from a middle class, and she loved him very much and tried to meet his expectations, but their minds never met. She could be his mate, but not soulmate. In Yoko, John found someone who was deep, challenging, intriguing, and independent. She was 8 years older than him, and she was on her second marriage, and that marriage was coming apart. People wondered if there was a fight between Epstein and the Beatles, and they denied it, and so did Brian. There seemed to be a struggle in the Beatles. So John, he was the original leader of the group, and Paul was asked to join the group because of John. But now Paul was his equal and was taking over. And Paul wasn't taking over being dictatorial, but because he had a natural interest in all levels of business, from cover design to shares of Northern songs and the energy to invest in them. John was lacking enthusiasm. Paul came forward when John started to withdraw. And drugs made matters worse. John would go on LSD binges that lasted for days, and that meant he couldn't be relied on to deal with business matters or make clear-minded decisions. LSD affected his sense of self-worth, and he wasn't able to assert himself vigorously enough in the studio. Instead of standing up to Paul as an equal, he would compromise and later regretted it. On the night of December 20th, John Edwards, a TV journalist from ITN's reporting 66, caught each Beatle as they approached the front door of the studio. John was the first to arrive. He was a passenger in a Mini Cooper. Asked if he could foresee a time when the group would no longer work together, John said, "I could see us not working together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or another. You need other people for ideas, and we all get along fine." John had no ambition to do further films, and Edwards asked him if he would continue to writing songs, whatever course his career took. And John said, "Yeah, we'll probably go on writing music forever, whatever else we're doing, because you just can't stop. You find yourself doing it whether you want to or not." And Paul showed up, carrying his guitar in his case and with a mustache, and he was asked if he would miss the business of touring should they retire from the stage. He said he wouldn't because, in his words, performance for us has gone downhill because we can't develop when no one can hear us. We want to do it, but we're not listened to, so we can't ever hear ourselves. We can't get any better. So we're trying to get better with things like recording. Ringo showed up and he was asked about touring. He said, "We don't want to do what we've done already, and we can't get a decent script for the next film, and we're still trying for one. If we don't do that, we'll possibly do something different next year. It's not like we're breaking up. We'll still come back together at the end of it." He was asked if he was bored with Beatlemania or even tired of the Beatles. "The thing is," Ringo said, "we can't do a tour like we've been doing all these years because our music has progressed and we've used more instruments. It'd be us going on stage, the four of us trying to do records that we made with orchestras and, bands and things. So if we went on stage, we'd have to have a whole lineup of men behind us." Ringo implied if the Beatles didn't make a film, he would take a role for himself. And John and Paul can write. George can learn a sitar. I've just been sitting around. The reporter asked, "Getting bored?" And Ringo said, "No, getting fat." So George appeared last, and he kept walking to try to avoid the reporter. The reporter asked him if they would be going their separate ways, and George said, "Definitely not." The reporter asked George, now almost out of earshot, would there be any more words, and then he said, "There aren't any more words." So I will end the video here, and we saw that John didn't really care for acting because he found it hard to be someone other than himself. He met Yoko, who challenged him mentally. Paul was trying his hand at a soundtrack with the help of George Martin. He also took time off to travel around from France to Spain to Africa. George Harrison came back from India, anxious to paint colors outside and inside his house. When asked by reporters if they were breaking up, each of the Beatles said no. During this time, they only wanted to stop touring. Things would start to change a little later, as we all know. The book 1966, A Revolutionary Year, has been great for providing nuggets that I didn't know about before, and I'm anxious to see more, and I'll share it with all of you. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it'll help me with my channel. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.